So Unity, as we kind of discussed, is the game development engine. This is their home website here. And it's used from everything from games to transport and manufacturing to film. Like there's a ton of things that you can use Unity for. One of the newer uses of game development engines was actually in The Mandalorian. It wasn't Unity that was used, but Unreal Engine, and they actually basically built an entire virtual set that they filmed for the actual TV series itself. So there's a lot of great uses outside of gaming that Unity and these other programs have, so it's just kind of useful to know. So this is their main website. There are two tabs that are really helpful when you're beginning with Unity. The first one is going to be this Get Started tab, button up here or down here. And this is where you can actually download Unity. Student and personal licenses are free. There are a couple of caveats to there. Really the biggest one is if your revenue or funding exceeds $100,000 in the last 12 months, then you have to pay for an actual plan. Honestly, if any of you end up making over $100,000, can you please share the wealth? Because I wish I was making that much with this so far. But there is a student license and a personal license. Either one of them work. And you actually end up with basically the full version of Unity with this. There's a couple of like support options that you get with the business and full plans, but those are sort of irrelevant. So if you don't have it downloaded already, you can download it from this website. All of the lab computers should have it on there.
Is there a difference between the student and the personal?
The main difference between the student and personal is going to be you get access to Learn Premium. You have 5 seats of Unity Teams Advanced if you want to do any collaboration, dark theme, and then real-time cloud diagnostics. Most of those are going to be irrelevant. I think the only ones that might be helpful is this access to Learn Premium, although there's a ton of other free resources. So there are some slight differences, but more or less they're going to be the same thing. The other tab that's really great is going to be this Learning tab. This is where you can find a ton of different resources to actually learn Unity itself. They actually have some of the greatest tutorials I've seen in a long time. They've actually won a couple of awards with them. So if you ever want to mess around and just take a look at some of these pages, they're a really, really great resource for you. Along with that then too, if you are interested in using the exact assets that I'm using today on our Canvas page, there is this Art3 57457 demo assets zip folder, which you are welcome to download. I will also have a link to that to a place to get that in whatever form of video file I end up with. Cool. So with that, let's jump into Unity. So when you download Unity, you're going to end up with Unity Hub. Unity Hub is kind of just their place to store all of the different versions and projects of Unity that you have. So you'll have a couple of different tabs here on the left side. The first one is Projects. This is just going to show you all of the different projects that are currently loaded onto your machine here. The next tab is the Learn tab. Again, these are going to be a lot of those tutorials and projects that they have. I really recommend taking a look at a lot of these because there's a lot of really great kind of beginner tutorials to get you started. If you're interested in VR, they have that. First-person shooters, platformers, 2D, beginners, RPGs, just a great kind of system of them. One of the ones I really recommend starting with is Rollerball, because the Rollerball tutorial goes through every little basic thing in Unity and will cover a lot of the things that I am going over in a slightly different way, so it might be worth it to jump into that at some point in these next few weeks. If you have some free time over spring break, this is a great place to start. Next thing is community. If you have any type of weird technical help, they have a forum, they have all their documentation, so this is a great place to find answers and help if Cyan or I are not available. The last tab is going to be installs, and these are going to be all of the different versions of Unity that you currently have installed. So with that, there is one huge caveat to using Unity. Do not upgrade in the middle of working on a project. I have had problems where I am using Unity for a project and then halfway through I upgrade, and now I have 3,000 error messages that I have to try to figure out what they're trying to tell me. Just stick to a version of Unity until your project's done. Or if for some reason you need to update, like there's a new feature that comes out that would be great to use, you're going to want to make a backup and then update after that backup's been created so you don't have to try to roll back and fix problems. Another thing to note is Unity has LTS versions of their software, which are long-term service. This means that these are going to be supported for several years to come. It also means that if there's any type of bug problem that's found in a new version, all of those fixes will be rolled back to an LTS version. Say, for instance, I was using 2019.1.14 and they found a bug or error in 2019.2.18. They would fix the error in .2.18, but not in 1.1.14. However, they would roll back any fixes found in 2.18 to this long-term support. So I often recommend that you just stick with long-term support unless there's some type of beta feature that you absolutely need for your game. If you need to add a version of Unity, you can always click on this Add button, and that'll come up with this first menu of what version do you want to have. They have the LTS versions as well as what are the newest versions, and then different alpha and beta versions. Once you have a selected one, you can click Next, and then you have various different modules you can add in. These different modules allow you to build for a wide variety of different platforms. There's web platforms, which is HTML5, Lumen OS for Magic Leap, if you're using Magic Leap platforms, Linux, Mac, OS TV. I don't know anyone that has ever built for that ever. If you do, please let me know. Android phone build support as well as iOS build support. Once you have all of your things selected, you can click Done, and that'll actually start downloading the modules and everything you need. The lab computer should have a version already installed, so you don't need to worry about installing anything unless you're using your own computer at the moment, or somehow these got wiped. So once you have a version installed, you can go up to this Projects tab. If you already have a project, it'll show up here. Any of the ones that are grayed out, these are actually on a cloud build, so I have to re-download those. Any of these other ones that have black text, I'm ready to go with. If for some reason a project that you have isn't showing up, you can always click Add, and then you'll just navigate to wherever that project is saved to on your actual folder, your actual system itself. So say you have an external hard drive that you have a file saved on, you may have to re-navigate to that if you plug it into a new computer. The other option is hitting New. There's also a drop-down button so we can select a version that we want to use. I know that .2.18 is the newest one, so I might be inclined to do that, but I'm actually going to opt to 2018.4.16. So I'll click on that. That's going to be the long-term support version. And then I'm going to just click New. Once we click New, oh, this popped up on the Milo screen. Once we click New, we should see a dialog box similar to this. This is a pretty standard file creation dialog box. And we have a couple of different options here. We have 2D, 3D, and then a bunch of extra nonsense here. For now, we're going to be in 3D, but if you're going to be creating a project that you want to be a two-dimensional game, you would select 2D. These other ones, 3D with extras, VR lightweight render pipeline, lightweight render pipeline, high definition render pipeline, allow for a lot more post-processing and shader creation. So if you're wanting to do a ton of extra visual stuff, you may need to use one of these options. You'll just want to do research on those beforehand. We won't cover any of the shader, graph, or post-processing volumes in any of these 2 days that we cover Unity, but just know that they are an option available for you. So in this case, I'm going to make sure that 3D is selected. Then I'm going to go ahead and give my project a name. My project name, I'll just go Unity, I can't spell, demo, EA. This is 457? 457. If they want to follow along, they're welcome to. It might be helpful to follow along just so that you can play with the tools as we go through them. Again, this is recorded, so you don't need to do everything I am exactly doing, but I do recommend at least having Unity open so you can mess with some things. The next thing that we'll want to do is just choose a location to save the file. So here I'm going to go to my F drive, and I'll just real quick choose here, Unity Files, new folder, and this will be art 457. Select that folder. It's best to have an actual empty folder when you're creating any of these things, just so that you don't have any weird conflicts with different projects. And then once we click select folder, it'll just update that location, and then we'll hit create. And now we're going to sit here and wait for Unity to load. So once it loads, you're going to see something similar to this. So the first thing that we'll go over is just what each of these different tabs means. Whenever you're starting a new program, it's often very intimidating, seeing like, I don't know what inspector is, I don't know what this lighting option is. So I'm just going to go over each of these briefly and just the basics of what you're going to be doing in each of the tabs. If for some reason you don't see one of the tabs I have, you can always go to Window and then add and open any of these. So like if I didn't see my scene view, I could go to Window, General, Scene. If I need the animation window, animator, animation, any of these different things you can bring up. They do have quite a few different editors. They have an AI navigation editor, sprite editors, things, whatever holographic emulation for extended reality is. So they have a lot of different tools built into it. You're probably not going to use a ton of them other than these kind of basic ones that we cover. So the first thing is going to be up here. This is our scene view. So this is anywhere where we have the scene tab. This is going to be where you're interacting with the different game objects. You can middle mouse button to pan, right click to rotate your view, and then click to select. Something to kind of note with this is I do recommend using a 3-button mouse. I do not recommend using the Apple Magic Mouse, which doesn't have a middle button, and I also don't recommend using a trackpad, because both of those are going to just cause you a lot of headache and problems. Really try to track down a 3-button mouse. It's going to help you a lot. And this is kind of just something whenever you're working in a 3-dimensional space, really it's helpful to have a 3-dimensional mouse. You can also scroll to zoom in, and then you also have this widget up here that you can use to actually change your view to bottom, front, top, any of those. You can also switch between perspective and ISO. Isometric is really primarily helpful when you're doing 2D games. Oftentimes if you're doing 3D, you want the perspective unless you're trying to line something up exactly. The next tab that we'll want to take note of is going to be this game tab. This might be a separate panel, or this might be attached to something. This is going to render just whatever your current active camera is seeing right now. So if we go back to the scene view, we'll notice that we have this camera icon. This camera icon is giving us a camera preview when we select it, and that's going to be exactly what we see here. Something else to take note of is you can move these things around as you please. So I can have my game view and my camera view up at the same time. I can have my camera view down here, or I can keep it nested in here as well. So any of these tabs you can basically drag and place wherever you would like to. The next thing that's going to be pretty important is this inspector view over here. So inspector view is just going to show you the different properties of whatever game object you have currently selected. So in this case, when we have our camera selected, we'll have different we'll have the properties for that camera showing, and these will be unique to that camera object. Conversely, if we select this directional light, which is acting as our sun, we'll see different things related to the lighting source. So light, its transform, all these different things. Then if we go back to the camera, we'll notice that we now have camera and audio listener. So as we select in between these two, this will always update. Down here in our hierarchy, this is where we're going to see the different things that are currently in our scene. So right now we have sample scene open, as well as a main camera and a directional camera. If we select our main camera in the hierarchy, you'll notice that it's selected in the scene. If we select our directional light in the hierarchy, that'll select it in the scene. If we select our camera in the scene view, that will select our camera in the hierarchy. If we select our light in the scene view, that will select our light in the hierarchy. So this is basically just another way of organizing everything that's in our scene view itself. This actually becomes really helpful when you have a lot of different objects built in Unity itself, because it allows you to kind of organize things into a nice kind of neat hierarchy itself. The last thing that you'll probably need to worry about as a kind of beginner to Unity is going to be this project view here. This is basically just a file management system, and this is actually, if we were to right-click here and go to Show and Explorer, it might be Show and Finder in Mac, we'll have this window pop up, and is legitimately just a file structure system. So if we have this open, we can see assets. If we double click into assets, we have scenes, our scenes folder. So this is just mirroring what we actually have as far as our file structure here. So just note that you can actually navigate to through this actual panel in your File Explorer window just as easily as you can this window itself. So the next thing that we're going to do is go over some of the terrain building tools. So Unity has a couple of different ways to make basic primitives and basic objects in its actual interface. So there are ways to make things like basic cubes, planes, basic color materials, a bunch of things like that. Once you want to start getting more complicated, like if you wanted a brick texture or if you wanted like a character model or something like that, you're going to need to go to some type of external program like Blender, 3ds Max, Photoshop, Illustrator, something along those lines. One of the big things that Unity does, though, is they give you ways to make terrain. So if you're wanting to build something outdoorsy, you can do this pretty easily. So in your hierarchy menu, you can either click Create, or you can right-click and choose from this Creation menu here. So if we go to Create, 3D Object, you should see Terrain. You also note a couple of other ones: Cube, Sphere, Capsule, Cylinder, Plane, Quad, Ragdoll, Tree, Wind Zone, 3D Text. Like, they have a couple of different things that you can actually make this way. But for now, we'll just go with Terrain. So that'll take a moment to load. You'll get really used to Unity just taking its sweet time to load things. So now we have this terrain object loaded in that we can scroll out to. So every game object in Unity is going to have a position, a rotation, and a scale. So in this case, our position is 0, 0, 0, rotation 0, 0, 0, and scale of 1, 1, 1. 0, 0, 0 is going to be what's referred to as the origin position. And this is going to be right here in this area down here. And what's really nice about having a 0, 0, 0 origin, or whatever origin space you might want, is any object is going to reference that origin. So 0 is going to be the origin. If we move this way, it is now 297 units along the x-axis away from the origin. I'm going to reset that to 0. And that'll just move it back there. We also have scale, which will just be its relative scale. So if we were to say, all right, I want this to be 0.5, that will shrink this down. Alternatively, we can just leave this at 0, 0, 0. Typically with terrain, you don't really want to mess with it too much because it's a generated asset. Versus some of like the primitives, you're going to be rotating a ton. Like, it doesn't make much sense to have like a terrain that's been rotated. And it'll almost always, like you can even see here, it's been rotated, but it's actually still on the same plane. So we'll just leave that as is. We won't mess with that at all. The next thing that we'll have that's unique to this terrain is this terrain component, as well as a terrain collider. A terrain collider is basically just going to say this is our terrain. If something bumps into it, this just says, hey, something bumped into it. What's really nice is we can use that for various different interactions later on when we get to scripting. If you want to, like when you touch this certain terrain, play this music instead of this music, those types of things. The biggest thing though that we'll want to worry about though for the moment is this terrain section right here. For this, we have a couple of different options. We have a paintbrush tool, which this is the paint terrain tool. We have a couple of different things. We can raise or lower terrain, paint texture, set height, smooth the height, or stamp the terrain. Right now, we're going to mainly just worry about raise or lowering the terrain. We have various different brush presets that we can use down here. This is going to be pretty similar to like Photoshop brushes, where we select one. This would be like a soft round or a hard round. And when we select that and bring it over here, we can see a preview of it on our terrain itself. We can also adjust the brush size, so if we wanted this to be really big, we can, as well as the brush opacity, which is going to be essentially the strength. So if we crank this up to 100, you notice it's doing a lot really quickly. So we'll undo that real quick. If we drop this down to 1, we're not doing a ton on this terrain itself. It's going to take us a while to actually affect this. Real quick, I have a setting set up that's really annoying me, so I'm going to just deactivate that real quick. So you can see that there's some slight movement, and this is not perfectly flat anymore, but we're really only affecting it minimally in this case. Oftentimes what you're going to want to do is, I really don't recommend going over like a strength of 13 because it just becomes really unmanageable really quickly. Like this is already kind of like, all right, I'm really doing a lot to this. If for some reason you've made something really high that you don't want to, you can press Shift and that will lower your terrain. So if you just hold Shift while clicking, that will lower your terrain back down. So you can use this to drop it back down to the 0 point if you need to. So I recommend just playing with this a little bit, building up your terrain. I'm going to just really quickly generate something to use for the base level. Play with this a little bit. You can do different brushes that'll have different textures. You can use this to add some like dimpling and other textures to this. So like right now, I'm adding in like this kind of stippling texture. This would be great for like, like a beach where there's a lot of mud or something along those lines. There's this kind of textured brush, which is great for rock. So if you need something that has like a rock texture to it, this is a really fun one to use. So I'm going to go ahead and just scrape this in. It'll give us that kind of scrapey look. But definitely play with this for a little bit. Mess around with these terrains. Build something crazy. It's really fun to do. This is one of Cyan's favorite tools.
So Brendan, if you were to add like a player to that, how big would that map?
So this is going to...
By the scale?
Yeah, let me double check something real quick. Where is... So how you actually adjust the size is through this terrain settings under the terrain object area. In this case, trying to find it. Here's what it is. Terrain width is 500 units. Terrain length is 500 units. And the maximum height is 600 units. So what it's going to be is when you drop in your character, you're going to want to scale them accordingly to whatever your size is. So that's going to be a little bit of just kind of playing with it. If you drop in your player character and he's a 1x1, he has to move 500 units to get from one edge to the other. If you scale him up by 2, so he's a 2x2 area, then he only has to move 250, and so on and so forth.
Okay, and so you just adjust those numbers. And what happens if you adjust the scale, like in that initial slide? Is that
Scale is actually just, it doesn't actually do anything. So like if we adjust this so if we select this and then adjust the rotation, you'll notice that it's just not doing anything.
Yeah.
But the actual like origin point is going to move itself.
Yeah.
So like really you're not going to be affecting terrain through this itself apart from the position. Position is really the only thing that's going to affect the terrain, and that's just going to be wherever that terrain's local origin is compared to the terrain's world origin. Yes, it's right click to rotate, middle mouse button scroll to scroll in and out, click to pan, and then left click to select. But yeah, so this is where you're going to be affecting a lot of those terrain objects themselves, detail resolution, all those types of things. There's actually like a ton of different settings that you can really get into. For the most part, I wouldn't worry too much about this. I would just affect like your player for the scale for the most part, unless you have like a specific reason for messing with this. Yeah.
How do you adjust the strength again?
To adjust the strength of your brush, that's going to be this opacity. So if I jump opacity up to 100, it's going to do things really intensely. If I drop it down to 0, it won't do anything. I don't know why you would ever use 0, but 0 is an option. Something else that's probably going to be helpful for this that I forgot to mention. Say you lost where your object is, like you're looking over this way and you're like, where'd my thing go? If you select your object, then hover over the scene view and press F, it'll focus in on that object. So the shortcut for that is just have something selected, hover over the scene view and press F, and it'll just snap to whatever the object is. So like if I didn't know where my main camera was, I could select that and then press F, and it'll just find that for me. So just be aware of that. All right, so the next thing we're going to cover is another tool that's built into this terrain editor, and that's going to be, if Unity loads, come on, it's thinking. That's going to be the paint texture tool. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to actually paint different images and textures onto this terrain that we have. So the biggest thing here, though, is we need those textures first. So there's a couple of different ways to get that. You can either build something yourself or go to websites like CG Trader, Google Images. There's tons of different places to find these. And you can find all of these different, CG Trader has a bunch of free textures that we can use. You can also, if you go to Canvas, I have provided a couple for you if you want to just use the exact same ones that I'll be using. Let me log in here real quick. If you go to the Interactive Media class, then go to Files, and then Art 357, 457 Unity demo assets, you're welcome to download those. Or if you want to try to find your own, you're welcome to use those as well. Let me pull these up. Once you have them downloaded, they'll be probably in your downloads folder. You'll need to make sure you extract them. You will have something that looks like this. In there, there's going to be a couple of different files. The file that we're going to want is textures. And I've provided several different ones here that you're welcome to use. What we'll then need to do is, the first thing we're going to want to do is just make sure that we stay organized within Unity. One of the biggest pitfalls that people often fall into, really whenever they're working with any different interactive or large project, is they don't keep things organized. So Unity is going to have a couple of different ways for us to do this. The biggest one is create folder. So you can do that by right-clicking in this project panel, or by clicking create and then choosing folder. You can then name the folder. I'm going to name this one texture. But keeping up with your file management is going to be really important, because if we just drop everything into this assets folder, just from one of these textures, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different images that we're bringing in. So if we have 4 of them, that's already 20 images that we have to try to navigate through in this area down here. So we're going to create a new folder. Again, you'll do that by right-clicking and going to create folder, or by clicking on this create button in your project tab, and then selecting folder. Once you have that, we'll double-click into here, and we have a couple of different ways that we can get those images into Unity. The first way is going to be right-clicking, import new asset. From here then, we'll just navigate to wherever we have those files. So in my case, it's just the downloads folder. We'll go in here, select textures, and then we can select all of these. I'll select all of these boards and select import. Unity will take a moment and it'll say, hold on. It's going to read all of those files, and then now those are available for us to use. The other option is we can select all of the different things that we want to bring in from our file browsing, whatever that might be, whatever operating system you're in, and then we can just click and drag into Unity, into that textures folder, and it will do the exact same process. So once we have all of these different textures, we are now able to use these in a couple of different ways. You can use these to create materials, which is something we'll be doing a little later, or you can use these to create what's called a terrain layer. So if we go back to our terrain, selected by either clicking on it in the scene view or in the hierarchy, we will want to make sure that paint texture is selected for the actual tool set. So we were in raise or lower terrain. Now we're going to want to go to paint texture. From here then we have our terrain layers. So the first thing we'll want to do is go to edit terrain layers. Then we have two options. We either create a layer or add a layer. If we select add a layer, it's going to ask us, hey, what terrain layer do you already have in your program that you want to add? We currently don't have any, so we're going to go to create layer. Once we click create layer, it'll pop up with this dialog box here. What we're going to want to choose is we want to choose our whatever one of our objects, but we want this to be our color map, which is also referred to in Unity as an albedo map. And this is going to be the base image that you're basing all of these other mapping tools off of. So in this case, I'm going to choose Dirt1 base color. So you can select it by double clicking, and that will automatically add this terrain layer for us. What's also nice is that will automatically apply that as the base layer for all of your terrain. So in this case, my entire terrain now has this dirt texture built onto it. What that will also do is inside of our project folder, wherever we currently are, that's going to create this terrain layer object. So if you go to assets right now, since I was in textures, it created it there. You're going to see this new layer. Part of keeping up with this file management is going to be renaming things. So I'm actually going to name this dirt layer. That's going to just give me an idea of what the hell is this actual object. Now I have to refine it again. Dirt layer. That's going to give us an idea of what actually is this, what are we doing with this, as well just give me a sense of like, all right, if I want to find this, it's not like, all right, I know it's new layer something, so is it new layer 1, 2, 3, like that's just a nightmare to actually figure out. The next thing that we can do though is this will also have different properties that we can adjust in the inspector. One of the big ones that we're going to want to use is called a normal map. What a normal map is going to do is it's actually going to simulate 3D texture on an object. So what we can do here is we can click select. That same type of dialog box is going to pop up, and then we're going to choose Dirt1 normal and double click it. We are going to get an error message that says normal texture should be imported as normal map. What that is basically telling us right now is, hey, you're trying to use something that isn't marked as a normal map as a normal map. So what we'll need to do is find that Dirt1 normal. And then in here we have various import settings that we're going to adjust. Under texture type, which is the top option, we're going to just select normal map, then scroll down and click apply. What that'll do is it'll just say, hey, this is a normal map, and that error message should be gone now. Great. So now if we kind of zoom in on here, we can see that there's a little bit more of like this 3D texture going on. If we were to adjust this, we can actually see this is getting really intense. So if we bump this up to 43, we're getting this really intense like 3D effect. If we drop this down, we can actually go inverse and actually negate it. But if we're at 0, we're going to get kind of like this really flat image. If we go up to like 2 or 3, we're going to get this really intense 3D simulated image. So normal maps are a really, really powerful way to add in 3D effects without having to model this out. Normally, if we wanted to get any type of 3D variance, we would actually have to model this in. We would go into like Blender or something. We would model out this little square, and then we would have to figure out a way to repeat it. This is a way to really simply just say, hey, cool, let's just have it there. The other options we have are our specular highlight options. So if we want to Be great if my windows would actually open up on the screen that I'm showing. If we want to, we can actually adjust kind of like this tint of the actual object itself. This will become far more apparent when you're working with materials, but just know that specular is going to be this kind of highlight tinting that you're going to use. You can also change how metallic something is and how smooth something is. So in this case, this being mud, I'm going to change it to kind of smooth, and I'm going to say like mud is like kind of ish metallic, like it's not metallic, like, so it becomes a little weird. In Unity, you have a couple of ways of defining materials. In this case, it's metallic and smoothness. What you're defining is how metal is this thing, and that's not, does it like death metal, it's how close to like polished aluminum is this actual object, and then how smooth is this object, you know, is it kind of brushed or is it matte, you know, things like that. Then you also have this tiling feature here, which just adjusts the actual scale of each one of these repeated items. So if we go to 5 and 5, that'll make each one of these really large. If we say, you know, 3 and 3, that'll be medium. If we say 0.25 and 0.25, that'll be really small. In this case, I'll just do like 4 and 4. I think that'll look pretty good. From this point then, if we go back to our terrain, we can now paint with that texture. One of the issues we have right now, though, is that's our only texture. So painting with that texture on top of that texture isn't really going to do anything for us. What we'll want to do is go to Edit Terrain Layers and create another new layer. So we'll go to Edit Terrain Layers and Create Layer, and this is going to be the same process as making that first terrain layer. So in this case, I want to choose grass. So I'll double click on the grass, and you'll notice that it doesn't automatically add that in. That will also create a new layer down here, so I'm going to go ahead and real quick name that grass layer, and that'll just set that to be that grass layer. I'm going to find those albedos real quick. Grass normal, or normal map, sorry. And then I'll just make sure that the grass normal is imported properly. You don't have to import normal maps for all of these terrains. Normal maps are a completely optional thing to bring in. However, they are something that's really powerful and definitely advised to use because they'll give your actual terrain objects just that extra depth that makes it just ever so slightly more realistic, just gives it that extra little bit of information. The next thing that we'll be doing is basically the same thing that we were doing with our actual terrain painting. We have the same brush tools that we're going to be using to paint these actual images and textures on there. So we have a brush size that we can define as well as an opacity. So if we start to paint this in, we have a somewhat low opacity right now, so you'll notice that it's kind of taking a moment, but we're starting to paint this grass on here. If we were to set this to 100, it's just going to basically blotch that grass in. Typically, again, it's best to have some type of kind of low opacity and go over it multiple times. This is something that's pretty normal throughout most 3D modeling, 3D even just painting tools, is usually start with kind of like a light brush hand, but we can kind of paint this in. Say we went a little too overboard with the grass, we can always select this dirt layer, and whatever has this blue bar under it is your current selected, and we can repaint some dirt on here. But call your mom, tell her you're painting with dirt right now. I don't know what it means, but if your mom ever told you no, you're not allowed to paint with dirt, you can prove her wrong right now. So we'll go ahead and just play with that a little bit. You can add as many terrain layers as you want. So if I wanted to add in rock as well as metal as well as sand, I could have all of those in there and paint with each different one of those. Oftentimes what you'll see people do is they'll have like maybe a snow-capped mountain, then they'll have grass, then maybe in crevasses they'll have dirt and like rocks. They usually think about the actual terrain as it would stand in essentially real life. As like a slope gets more sheer, you'd probably have more of you'd have less vegetation, more just hard rock itself. So those are just things to take into consideration when you're actually painting these. Once you kind of have all of your textures in there, there are a couple other tools that exist within the terrain one that you should just know about. You may or may not end up using them, but they're kind of more finishing tools. There's the set height tool, where you press Shift and select a point, and then anywhere you paint will just automatically become that height slowly. So if I wanted it, if I wanted to make like a nice plane or something like a plateau, this is a great way to do that. The other one is smooth height, which just allows you to kind of smooth out your actual area. So what it'll do is it'll just take the height at your basically anywhere this brush is. It'll just take the average of the height of that area and just kind of smooth everything out to be around that same height. There's also a stamp terrain tool, which allows you to kind of just basically stamp these actual brushes into the terrain themselves and kind of do one-off little intense objects. There's definitely play around with these. Really helpful tool to know, especially if you want to do any type of outdoor terrain. I am going to move on to kind of the next step and some of the next things to consider. So we created this basic terrain in our scene, but terrain is not the only object we can create. As I kind of mentioned, if we right click, we'll get this create menu. You also can go down to create and then select something. But if we go to 3D object, there are cubes, spheres, capsules, cylinders, planes, quads, all of these different objects that we can create. In this case, I might want a cube, and that'll automatically just place it into my scene. Now my cube is really small. It is 1 by 1 by 1, so you can kind of just barely make it out, but if we click F, we'll be able to focus in on it. Comparatively to our terrain, this is actually pretty small. So cubes have positions, so I can move it along one of the axes. Rotation, I can rotate it along an axis. I'll reset that to 0. And I can also scale it. So say I wanted this cube to be 50 by 50 by 50. I can do that, and now I'm inside the cube. Something to take note of is I am currently inside the cube, and therefore it is not rendering. All objects only render one side of their faces. So the terrain that we created is actually referred to as a mesh. So if we go under, it is actually a plane. So if we go underneath it, we can't actually see it. That's because really there's no reason to render the bottom side of the terrain, because in theory you're never going to be underneath the terrain, and if you are, you're going to be in a cave, and you're going to need to actually model out that cave. So in this case, if we go inside of one of these objects, we're not actually going to see anything. So just like with our terrain and some of our other objects, we have multiple different components in here that are related to that actual object itself. So in here we have a cube mesh filter, a mesh renderer, which actually just shows us the object itself, a box collider, and then a material that's assigned to it. Same thing goes for any other object we create. Like we might want to create a sphere, and if we do, we can see this tiny little sphere floating around here. We can move this around as much as we want. Shortcuts for the movement tools are going to be W for move, E for rotate, and R for scale. So if I press W, you're going to see these gumball handles, and what we can do is we can actually click and drag to just move this as we please, or we can always use this actual positional transform system that's in the inspector. Either way, we'll move it. This is great for something that doesn't need to be an exact position. Using the transform component is going to be the best for actually setting something exactly where you need to be. So like say this needed to be at the origin. I don't want to click and move this. I want to just enter in the origin 0, 0, 0. So say we wanted to add a component to something. Like say I wanted this sphere to have physics properties. You can always click this add component that's on the bottom of the inspector. And in this case, we can, if we didn't have something that was already searched for, we can navigate these menus. Or in this case, I know I want it to have physics properties, so I'm going to search for rigid body. So rigid body. Rigid bodies are just the basic component that does physics interactions for Unity. So in this case, if we have this here, if we click run, I'll need to navigate back to the scene view. Oh God, do not maximize and play. Give me a moment. Run. Whenever you click run, it'll automatically default to the scene view, but you can see that that sphere, this sphere is going to actually just drop whenever we move it up. So you'll notice I can actually interact with this in real time using these different editor tools. So I can move this up, but because it has this rigid body component, it's automatically going to use gravity. We can turn that off if we want, where it's just like chilling there, or we can have it on. We can also adjust things like mass, like say we gave this a mass of 60, that's going to be really, really heavy, so it's going to fall a little faster now. I'll just leave that at 1 for now. But you can add those components to pretty much any game object that you want. So I'm going to just click that run button again to get out of there. The next thing I might want to do, though, is add walls to prevent my player from falling off of this terrain, because then they're just going to continue to just exist in this limbo phase where there's nothing, and all they'll see is this weird cube floating in space. So I'll go ahead and right-click, say go to 3D Object, and select a plane, because we don't need to render both sides of this plane. I'm going to go ahead and just for now set the position to 0, 0, 0. That's just going to give me kind of a base point to work with, so I don't have to worry about like, all right, where is this right now? And then I'm going to rotate this, let me figure out what axis, along the x-axis 90 degrees. Oh. So now if I select that plane and I press focus and zoom into that, you'll notice, oh, okay, I can't see anything on this side, but if I rotate to this other side, I actually see the plane. Again, this is actually going to be basically the same thing as our terrain, where it doesn't actually have anything rendered on one side of it, because there's really no reason. The point is we want this to be a wall, so you'll never see anything on this current side that we're currently viewing it from. The next thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to place this about halfway, at the halfway point of our terrain. So if we remember, our terrain, when we went into the settings, was 50 units wide, so we'll go to 50 to just give that section there, and then I'm going to bring this up a little bit. We'll just go with a nice round 50, and then scale, I'm just going to, wrong one. Scaling something in the Y dimension doesn't always do anything. And I'm just going to scale this up until it's about the same size as my actual terrain itself to create these nice walls. So that's actually about 50, so we'll just give it 50 there. And now we can see we have this kind of nice wall on this left side. We'll just want to make sure we drop it down so that it covers all of our terrain and we don't have any weird gaps in it. Then what we can do is we can go Control D to duplicate, or you can right click and choose duplicate to get a second wall. That's going to duplicate that object the exact same properties that we have. So it's going to be the exact same spot with the exact same position, rotation, and scale. What we can then do is we can actually drag that new one out and just bring it over to the other side here. I'm going to set that position to be 500, 500, not 50. Again, because I know that the position, I know that we'll put it at exactly the edge of my terrain because that terrain was 50. And then I'm going to have to make sure I rotate this along the one of the axes so that it's actually facing the proper dimension. So I'm going to put that x-axis -90 in this case. It might differ for you. You'll just have to play with it until it looks right. And that's going to flip it 90 degrees so that it's at the right orientation. The next thing I'll want to do is duplicate that again, and I'm just going to duplicate this twice actually. That way I have all 4 walls so that I make sure the player doesn't end up running off of this actual stage. So in this case I'll Z90, then I'll just move this into the rough position, move my camera view, and then I'm going to set this to be the actual position I need. So we'll go to 50 and 500 because we know that that's going to set it so that it's exactly halfway on the z-axis and it's exactly at the edge on the x-axis. Then we'll do the same thing for that other duplicate that we have. We'll need to rotate this again along the z-axis. This time we'll do -90 to flip it the other way, drag it into the position we need it. So 250, and we'll set this to be 0. So that should put it at the origin. Great. So now we have our 4 walls. As we move around it, we should be able to see them appear and disappear depending on what orientation we're at. Great. The last thing we may want to do, though, is our scene hierarchy is getting a little crazy. We have this really handy tool called an empty object. So if we go to the Create menu, you'll see Create Empty. What Create Empty is going to do is create this game object that only has a position, rotation, and scale properties under the transform. So I'm going to set that to be at the 0 position so I always know where it is, and then I'm going to actually name this environment. I have caps lock on. What this is going to do is this is going to actually essentially just going to act as like a folder for us. What we can then do is select our terrain, our cube, our sphere, our plane, all 4 of our planes. And you can do that by just holding down Shift and selecting, same way that you would do with any other file management system. And we can click and drag and basically make those as what's called children of the environment, which basically just groups everything into here. What's really nice, though, is say we needed to actually move all of our environment stuff. If we select environment, if we move this, it'll actually move everything. So it works both as kind of like a folder to hold everything, as well as a group to just make sure that everything stays together. So this is a great way to actually kind of make sure everything stays together. Like if we had a player that also had like a model that had like a mesh model on it, it had like a rocket boosters on it, it had particle effects, it had a gun with like physics based on all of that. We might want to make another empty object that's just called player. It's a great way to just kind of group things so you can edit things quickly and you can keep track of things. Because the other thing we can do now is, say I don't want to do any more editing on my environment, I can just click this drop-down caret and hide all of those things. So play around a little bit with creating different objects, cleaning up your space, seeing what components might exist that might affect them. Cool. So we'll keep trucking along here. The next thing that we're going to do is set up some materials, because creating objects is cool, but they're just kind of these gray white blobs at the moment. Like this box is kind of boring. So what we're going to do, we're going to create some materials for these. So first thing we're going to want to do is go back to our assets folder and just make sure that we're keeping up with our file management, and we'll name this folder materials. Unity has a really strong material program built into it and a way to generate materials. So when we open up materials, we can right click or go to the create menu, select create, and then find material. Same way that we've been doing this so far. You'll just need to make sure you're in the project area. And I'm going to name this material red because I want this to just be a red material. You can name it whatever you want. You could say cube material 1, anything works. It's just usually best to have something that actually makes sense in this case. Then over here in the inspector, we're going to see a preview of what the current material looks like, which right now it's just a default white basic material. So we're going to start by just editing this. So the first thing is up here, shader. We're going to leave it at standard right now, but just know that there are a ton of different types of materials you can use. Standard is the one that you're going to use 90% of the time. It's just the basic Unity material. Then we have rendering mode. For now, we'll leave it at opaque, but you can also do things like transparent, fade, cutout, all these other ones. Transparent's really fun if you want to make glass, but it takes a little bit of finesse to get working. We'll just leave it as opaque for now. We'll then click on this box, and this is going to be essentially the tint color, which in this case, since we don't have an albedo map, is actually just going to be the color. So if I want it to be red, I'll just choose a nice red here. And now I have this red material. Then same thing that we saw with our terrain layers, we can adjust how metal it is. If it's at 1, it really, really likes death metal. If it's at 0, it's a country girl. Sorry, bad joke. And then also how smooth this is. If we go all the way to 0, think of that as like a matte finish where it's kind of just, it's still kind of rough, but it's very diffused, like there's no like highlights or anything. If we go all the way to 100, it's going to have like super high gloss. Think of this as like a freshly extruded plastic or something. So if we go all the way up to metal, all the way up to gloss, we're going to get this super intense shiny. If we put it somewhere in the middle, it'll be somewhere in between there. And what we can think of as far as the metal is something at 100% metal or 1 metal is going to be like brushed aluminum. Something at 0 is going to be like a stick. So I'll just put it somewhere in between because that should be fine. And then we have a couple of other different options. You won't need to worry about these for the moment. The biggest ones that we'll want to worry about are going to be normal map and albedo, but that'll be in just a moment. So then what we can do is when we select an object, like say this cube, we can actually click and drag this onto this cube, and that'll automatically apply that material to it. So now we can see here it has that red material applied to it. And then we can also edit it here from this actual area. But say we wanted to make our walls red too, we can click and drag onto the walls, and set all of our materials, set all of our different objects to be this red. So I'll just do that real quick. The other thing that's really cool about this is all of these are linked to the same material. So if we go here and say, I actually want this red to be a little more orangey, we can do that, and you'll notice that it's actually changing in real time. So as I'm changing this, it's adjusting the objects in my scene. So we'll do more of like an orange-red. Great. So I close that, and now this has more of an orange-red look to it. Cool. That's really great, but what if I want something to be something other than just basic colors? What if I actually want to use like maybe I want to use those boards that we brought in. You can do that. What we do is we just, same process, create material, and we'll name this wood. And then from here, what we'll do is when we have a wood selected, we're actually going to go to this albedo map. If you click this little circle next to this box area, that'll bring up this selection tool. In this case, I'm just going to select these boards, and that'll automatically apply these boards here. Now, I'm going to just make this a little bigger so it's easier for you to see, but right now this looks really flat. Again, that's where this normal map comes in. So we'll bring in this normal map, and now you can see that we already have a little bit more depth to this. As we increase this, you're going to see it's like way more intense. Like this has much more of a 3D look to it. So again, normal maps are just a really cheap, easy way to apply a lot of that. But along with that, we have a couple of other different types of maps. We have metallic maps, which I don't know if I actually included those. Ignore the metallic maps. So there are different metallic maps that you can do. This will just define like how metal the thing is. But what it's going to do is rather than just doing like a all around like, all right, it's either going to be super metal or not very metal, it's going to say like these areas are going to be metal. We are also having this texture map not marked as a normal map problem. I'm just going to click this fix now, and that'll automatically apply the changes for me. We could also navigate over and change that. We also have height maps, which if we go to board's height, that'll adjust that height map. That's just going to give it more data to work with when we're actually looking at this normal mapping. Great. So all of those are going to just give multiple data or different data to actually set this up. The next thing we can do is we can apply this material the exact same way that we applied any of the others. So if we click and drag this wood material over here, you can now see this wall has like these wood boards on them. Now they look super stretched out and honestly terrible. We're going to fix that by going to this tiling section here. So we might want to go more like 0.5 to see if that looks a little better. Still looking a little funky, so maybe we'll do 0.25, see if that looks better. 0.25, still not. What does 5 by 5 look like? Getting there, so just, we can play with this until it looks pretty good. So we'll do, say 2 by 3. I think that looks good enough. Great, so we can do that. You can apply this to as many materials as you want. I believe you can also click and drag onto the hierarchy to adjust. The big issue here, though, is if we don't have it named properly, what am I dragging to? So, like, which plane is this? I don't know. So I'm going to opt to actually just drag them into the actual scene itself. So again, that process is just create material. We can set a highlight color, which this will either just be the color of the material, or say we go into albedo. In this case, I'm going to actually create a metal base color texture. If we select this one, you'll notice that it's actually changing the tint. So if we wanted to give this like a little blue tint to it, we can do that by adjusting this albedo highlight. Next thing we'll do is this one's going to be the roughness map, which makes it super smooth. I'm going to just change the smoothness a little bit. Go into normal map, same thing, just find the normal map for the corresponding texture. Next week when we talk about Blender a little bit, I'll be covering how you can actually make these normal maps yourself really easily. But for now, you can just find them online. Or, again, these are all optional. You don't have to use these. What am I looking for? Height map. There it is. Height map. Cool. So now we have this like kind of weird metal texture. We'll want to make sure we name this because, again, having just a series of new materials one is not going to help me out at all. So metal, and then we can say, oh, I want this metal to be applied to this box, per se. And then when we select that box, we can zoom in and see, okay, cool, it has this like weird metal texture on it. And then I'm not going to forget about our sphere. I'll make that the red one. So cool. We have all of these different materials that we can play with. Pretty simple to get them set up. Great. If we hit run and we actually start this game, well, first off, our camera's not in the right space, and we can't do anything. We can't move around. All we get is this nice, pretty view. So we could fix the first problem of our camera actually not viewing anything by physically moving this camera into the space. So we can move this camera in. I'll drop it down so you can see the ball interaction. So now if we hit run, it'll actually run this. We can see the ball fall. Great, cool. Doesn't do us much good. This is where things like the asset store come in. Because it is totally possible for us to create a player character. We could get a model out of Blender, make that ourselves. We could use just a basic object. We could use just like a capsule for it. We could do all that, but then we're going to need to go into scripting. We're going to need to go into like, all right, when we push this button, we need to move the character. That's something we can do, but it's not necessarily necessary. So what we can do is we can go into this tab, Asset Store. If you don't see this, I believe it's under... Which one is it under? I know there's a way to get to here. Yep. No, it's Window Asset Store. Or Control 9, which I don't ever remember that. So great. We have, once it loads, we'll have this window pop up. You can also access the Asset Store using any web browser. So you could go onto Chrome and go to Unity Asset Store and find all of this. What we're going to look for, if I can actually figure out, there's my search function. What we're going to look for is the standard assets. So there are a lot of different assets on Unity. Right now, though, I know exactly what I need. It's the standard assets. These are great because they have a lot of different things that you need to get your project up and running super quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up, and then in here you're going to see either a download or an import button. I'm going to go ahead and click import because I already have this downloaded to my computer. If it needs to download, it'll also need to download. Again, you're just going to wait and chill out for Unity to do its thing. So I would encourage all of you to actually go through, and if you're following along with this project, to actually go to the Asset Store and download this, because this is how you're going to add in basic player interaction. This is how we're going to actually walk around our scene. So feel free to do that while this is taking its sweet time to actually import everything for me. You're also welcome to mess around with anything that we've done so far at this point. So once you've downloaded the standard assets and you've hit the import button, you should have this dialog box that comes up, which is the import Unity package. And what we're doing is we're actually importing these packages basically just from the internet. So once this comes up, you'll see a list of whatever you're trying to import in. It just kind of tells you everything. It's also possible to create custom packages, by the way, so if you need to like export something from a project into a new project, you can build one of these yourself. But in this case, if you scroll down, you can find everything in here. I guarantee you won't be using everything in here, but it's best just kind of keep the package together because unselecting one thing might break everything. So in this case then, we'll just make sure all is selected and then click import, and then that's just going to import the packages for us. It'll take a moment again. Again, you'll get really used to just sitting around and waiting for Unity to do stuff, so you'll go make yourself a nice cup of coffee, grab a soda, start dinner. But anyway, once you have that package imported, it's going to... Oh, that's weird. This is what you don't want to see. Lots of this. Says it's fixing it, so I'm just going to clear that. This is another window that you should always be aware of, is the console. This is going to be where Unity tells you, hey, stuff's broken. Or, hey, something's not working right. So just keep an eye on here. It'll always be visible like down in this area. It'll be like red bar that says text. So just know that that exists. When you import a package, it's going to create its own files in your assets folder. So here if we go, we'll have the standard assets package. So now under assets, we have standard assets and all of our different things in here. This has a ton of different things that you can play around with, and it's definitely probably worth your time to download a couple packages, mess around with them, see how other people are building things. In this case, I know exactly what I want. So I'm going to make sure my scene view is selected. And then I'm going to search FPS. And we're going to be using this FPS controller, or first-person shooter controller. What that's going to do is it's going to be a player controller that has all of the functionality that we need for just a standard 3D FPS game. So I'm just going to click and drag that into my scene view, and voila, I have a player. One issue that we're running into right now, though, is this is going to actually be a collection of objects, and one of the objects on here is a camera. When we have two different cameras in Unity, it can often start doing some weird things unless you have it set up properly. So I'm going to go ahead and just make sure I delete the main camera that we've been using so far, just to make sure there's no compatibility issues. But now, if I hit run, I'm able to walk around. And this will be standard first-person shooter controls. You can press space to jump, shift to sprint, use the mouse to look around, and then W, A, S, and D to move. Great. It even has footsteps for us. So in order to get out of here, I need to press escape so that I can actually see my mouse cursor, and then I'll just click play again to stop it. So cool. We have our player. We can move around the scene. Great. What do we do now? We have a player. We can walk around. But there's not really anything interesting to necessarily interact with. So if we remember from our flowchart from earlier, the whole point of this game is going to be collecting coins. So in this case, we're going to need to make sure that we have a coin that we build. To do that, we're actually going to just use very simple primitives. So in this sample scene, we're going to right-click, choose 3D object, and choose cylinder. I'm then going to focus in on the cylinder so I can actually edit it. I'll go ahead and rotate this, not along that axis, along this axis till it's at 90. Then I'm going to scale this down. Scale this down to, let's say, 0.2, 0.1. So we have this kind of nice thin coin object. Now along with this object, you'll see this green outline. That is our collider. So this is the capsule that it's doing. So if anything comes within that green bounds, it's going to say, hey, you ran into something. And then later on when we add scripting, we can actually use that to add logic to this. What we'll do is we have this coin. I'm going to go ahead and actually drag this above the ground real quick and just move this into some place where there's actually light so I can kind of see what I'm doing with it. I'm also going to go back to auto generate. This will bake the light in for me. So cool. We have this coin. Coding's next week. So at this point, you know, today, as Cyan brought up, like you're probably going to want this object or an object like this for next class. We won't be doing any coding today, but I'm setting everything up so that when we actually get to the code side, we can actually make sure everything's interacting properly and we don't have to build something last minute. So in this case, I created the coin. The other thing I'm going to want to do is go to materials and create a material for like a gold texture. I'll name this just coin material. Then I'll set it to be like a kind of goldish color, close enough. I'll set it to be really metallic and fairly smooth. And now if I apply this to the coin, we have this nice little coin structure. Cool. Big issue though right now is this coin doesn't have a way to actually interact with the environment. It's literally just going to float there. So if we set the coin above our players' heads, it's going to be like someone holding something above your head and you're trying to grab it. That's not really fun to play. You're just going to be staring at it, jumping up and down like, hey, let me see this. If any of you are as bad at me as basketball, you definitely know this feeling. So what we'll do is we'll go to add component and we'll just choose that rigid body component again. That way it'll add physics so it'll actually drop down to the ground. So if we hit run, and we go find that coin, should be over this way. We can see our coin is kind of just spazzing out on the ground. Just rolling down this hill. We can also kick it because we also have a rigid body component added, so we can kick this around too. Basically anything else that has a collider on it will be able to affect this rigid body. Great. So we have these. We have this basic coin that we can interact with that can do stuff. Cool. What else might we want to do with this? You know, well, one of the issues I ran into is that coin's now kind of floating everywhere down the hill. We may want to actually constrain this so that it can't actually move along any two of the axes. So if we come up here, Y is going to be our up-down axis. I know it's super counterintuitive, but Unity, Y is up and down. Just be aware of that. So in this case, we actually want to freeze position on both the X and the Y, or the X and the Z axis, so it can't slide down the hill like it just did. I'm just going to leave it so that it can only move along the Y axis. You're totally welcome to allow your coin to like fall down the hill if you want to, though. The next thing that we might want to do is add some visual pizzazz to this. And pizzazz is a very technical term that you should all know. It will be on the test. There's no tests in this class. Anyway, what we might want to do is, first off, we're going to want to name this coin so we actually know what we're talking about rather than just cylinder. Next thing we want to do is we're going to go down here and click Add Component, and we're going to go to Animation. Unity has an animation program built into it. It works basically the same way as any other animation you ever used. It's not nearly as nice as using, say, like a Blender program or an Adobe Animate where they're designed for animation, but it works really well for basic animation like we're going to do in this part. All I want is the coin to just rotate around the Y-axis. So we'll click Animation. So we have multiple different animation clips that we can do. Not really helpful at this point. What we'll do is go into Assets, and we're going to choose Create, and then Animation. Yep. So Create Animation. And now we should be able to go into this Animation tab and actually animate this once we apply the animation of the property to the object.
Stop there.
There's one other thing.
Okay.
The other option that we can do is if, say, and this is actually the easiest way to do this. I just wanted to show you the actual way to add this from components. You can always remove components by using this gear. We'll go remove component. What we can do is actually go into animation and then just click create, and that'll automatically apply everything for us. We'll just have to define, this will be coin rotation, and we're just going to save this in the assets folder. When we click save, that'll set everything up for us. Once you have a coin in the player, we're going to jump into a little bit of animation. The animation part is more or less optional. This isn't something that will actually affect any of the functionality next week, but make sure you have the coin. So what we're going to do is once we have our coin, I'll actually back up real quick. Z. So you have your coin, you'll select it, then under the animation tab, which if you don't see it, go to Window, Animation, Animation. And what you're going to do is just click Create. That's going to create everything for you. I'll just replace this coin rotation that I have. And that's going to create everything for you, the animation clip, the animator, and the actual animation component as well. Once that's in here, again, it functions basically the same way as any other animation thing you might have. In this case, we'll click Add Property. And then we have a couple of different components here. So what we're going to be doing is animating the components themselves. So what's really cool is you can actually animate the gravity on this. So you could like make it heavier or lighter if you wanted to. For now, what we're going to do is just select transformation, and I'm just going to choose rotation. So I'll just select rotation. And then in this drop down, just like any other animation program that you've probably seen, we have rotation X, rotation Y, and rotation Z, as well as keyframes. So, yeah, and as we go through, it'll just show us what frame we're on. I'll go all the way over here, select these ones, and I want it to rotate around the Y-axis. So this Y-axis, tab out of that. So I want it to go from 0 to 360. I want it to do basically a full loop. So now we can see that our coin is going to be rotating. So if I hit play, we're just going to see it rotate. Now you'll notice it's doing something weird where it's kind of like slowing and starting back up, and it has like this variable velocity. That's being affected by these curves down here. Oh god. So there's this curves tab in the animation. And what that is you can see there's this X value, which is the yellow one, which we know because it's this yellow little dink color thing down here. So what we can do is we can actually adjust these curves to be more linear. So if we adjust the curve to be linear, we get a much smoother rotation. So just know that there's two different ways to actually animate something within Unity. You can either use a dope sheet with your actual keyframes. That's the word I'm looking for, keyframes. Or you can use a curve to define what location it should be at. And it's always going to be time and then whatever value you're adjusting. So in this case, rotation. Great. So we have our coin, it's spinning. Again, if you haven't gotten that far, don't worry about it. You can do this next step regardless of whether you have animation built in or not. The next thing is going to be creating what's called a prefab. So we're going to go back to the project view real quick. I'm also going to create a new folder, and I'm going to name this prefabs. And this folder is going to just contain the different prefabs that I'm going to use. What I'm then going to do is this coin that we just added the animation to, I'm going to click and drag that into this prefabs folder. What that's going to do is it's going to take this coin from my scene and basically duplicate it. So now I have in this prefabs folder a coin that is an exact copy of whatever is in this scene. So if I were to delete this coin from my scene, I still have this coin prefab. This is essentially going to be an asset that's going to live within your project but won't necessarily be in every scene. But what the power of this is now I can click and drag as many coins as I want to in here without having to duplicate, without having to worry about it. It's also really helpful later on when you start scripting because you can use this to actually instantiate objects via scripting. So I can actually use a line of code to create objects when a player pushes a button or when a player does a certain action. So now if I run, literally run over here, I can see I now have a bunch of different coins spinning around this area. Great. So now that I have all these coins here, I'm able to create as many as I want. The other really powerful thing about prefabs is that I can edit this prefab. So say I'm like, oh, I actually think that the animation is too fast. I can go into this prefab and I can actually move this out so it takes a little longer for it to actually animate. And I can make this, say, like really, really slow, per se. Let's increase the sample to 240 frames real quick. So I can drag these keyframes out and make it take a really long time to rotate. Then if I go back into my hierarchy, which if you ever go into something, it's kind of the same as isolation view in something like Illustrator. We can back out of there and go back into this. But now if I hit run, go to my scene view, you'll see that these are now rotating much slower than they were. So it's really great to have these prefabs because you can create as many as you want of them without having to select all of these and copying and pasting or duplicating. And you can also create multiple of them using scripting components later on. So there are definitely still more things that you can go into with Unity. I do recommend checking out some of the tutorials if you're curious about this. The other thing that's really helpful is the Unity documentation, which I'll pull up here real quick. So Unity documentation, which is going to be their user manual. And this is going to have all of the things that you might want to know. So say I'm like, oh, I want to know more about 2D. How does gameplay in 2D works? It's going to have a bunch of information about how 2D physics works, how the graphics work, because it's going to be slightly different from 3D, but it'll still have a lot of the same parallels. The biggest thing is you just don't have that extra dimension built into there. It'll, say you want to know more about sprites. How do I create sprites? What's required for that? What programs am I going to use? This will cover a lot of the different things regarding sprites, what they require. Do you need a PNG? How are you importing those types of things. This will also be helpful if you need to get into scripting because there's this scripting API. If you select scripting API, it's basically the same thing as the manual, but this is basically only covering the actual scripting components. So say I want to know say I wanted to know about instantiation. I can search instantiate. It's going to take a moment to search, and then I can go, all right, what's object.instantiate? And then it's going to give me all the information about what you're doing with that as well as different code samples. So especially next week once we get into scripting, we're going to be referencing this a lot, and it's really helpful. For now, if you want to just know more about the different tools that are available, this Unity user manual is a great place to start. The other place is going to be Unity Learn, and it's going to be the kind of tutorials I was already talking about. Great place to start. I definitely recommend the Rollerball tutorial if you want to just get a jump start on some of the stuff that we're talking about, and if you have a free moment over spring break. So Rollerball tutorial. There's a project you can download from the asset store, and you can also find the videos online. I also recommend checking out the Unity asset store. Just checking out what they have. They have a ton of both paid and free stuff. So, say I only want to see free assets. Great, you can only see free assets. So here's the standard assets we are using. Here's Sunnyland, which might be great for 2D. platformer game assets, which is great for 2D. And these will be everything from scripting to new tools. Like Pro Builder is a way that you can actually build levels in Unity itself without having to go to a 3D modeling program, as well as like low poly simple nature packs. So if you really know you need low polygon trees, you can do that. There's other terrain tools that you can find, just tons of different things that you can check out and find. If you're interested in VR, the Steam VR plugin is absolutely phenomenal for that. It gives you a bunch of tools to do just very basic stuff very quickly. If you want to do a space robot game, you can grab this apparently. So tons of different things to play around with and mess with. Really the thing about Unity is we've covered the basics today. Really, if you want to get better at it and you want to learn more about Unity, really you just need to sit down, pick a project, and do it. You know, finding tutorials is a great way to force yourself into like this is the project I'm going to make. Oftentimes, when we're first starting, it's kind of hard to be like, oh, I kind of want to do this, but I don't know how to approach it. It's way simpler to just say, here's the project we're going to make, just go for it. Yeah, definitely recommend just playing around with these things, taking a look at it. If you're interested in the 3D design world, but Unity wasn't your cup of tea, you might check out something like Unreal. It functions very similarly, but has a slightly different tool set. There's also other programs that we've kind of already discussed, things like Game Maker, which is designed for 2D stuff. There's the Godot engine, which is an open source one, but that one's a little more difficult to use at the moment because they just don't have a lot of documentation.